Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. I am back today with an easy one-layer card. Now, I gotta be honest, when I first started making this card, I really didn't have a clue as to what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to use some of the images out of the W+9 Winter Pal stamp set, but I didn't really know what direction I was gonna go with it. So that's kind of what this is about, but really, I tried to keep it as simple as possible. Now, this is the Winter Pals, and this stamp set is so cute. I've had this in my stash for a while, and a friend of mine shared a card on Instagram not too long ago, and it was like, oh, I have the stamp set. I really need to get it out. There's lots of different things that you can do with it. All of these critters are just darling. That little owl and that tree there, you could actually turn that tree on its side and put the owl on it, make it look like he's sitting on a branch. You can put the earmuffs on it. The sleigh or the sled, it's just so cute. Plus, it has all these amazing sentiments to go with it. Now, this is the landscape border dies by W+9, and we're going to be doing some masking and ink blending with those. It's all going to be super simple. Just stay tuned, and I'll show you how I do that. One of my kids gifted me with a little bowl of gummy bears there, so I could stack on them while I decided what I was going to do here. All right, so I have a 4¼ by 5½ inch card panel. This is Neenah Solar White cardstock because I am going to be doing some Copic coloring. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm just kind of lining up my stamps, trying to decide how I want them. Now, I need to stamp the bear and the fox first, but I need to make sure that I'm going to have them straight on the pond and the sleigh or sled. So I put those on top of those, and then I pick them up with my Misty stamping tool, pull off the bottom ones, and ink them up with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, and then I'm just going to stamp them on there. I don't show you, but I do double stamp them so I have some crisp outlines. And then I am taking some 3M full stick post-it notes, and I have those cut down in masks. I doubled them up when I stamped them. And I'm not using the top inked image. I'm just using the second layer that I had cut out, because I don't want the ink from that to bleed into the ink blending that I do later. Now, I put the second tree on there. I masked that off, or kind of put a piece of 3M Post-it tape there, because I didn't want to ink past that. I was only going to have a partial tree. Forget about that. Ignore it. Just pretend that's not there. Moving on. So I do also want to make it look like this pond is actually setting in the ground. So I'm just wiping off that bottom line, and it's not going to be perfect, but I will go back over it with a Copic multi-liner to fill in those lines and make sure that they're nice and crisp. All right, so I have everything stamped on there that I want, with the exception of one tree. And instead of using the Misty again, I'm just going to get out my acrylic block and stamp it that way. It's really easy. There was no need to continue using the Misty. So I'm just going to do it that way. Now, I will warn you, cutting out those trees, they have like a sharp point. This is what I like about the 3M Post-it, or the 3M Post-it notes, is they actually stay pretty good when you do some ink blending over it, but you do need to be careful when you get to that point. I was just erasing some of my lines that I didn't clean off too well on the stamp, and that was really easy to do with the Tombow Mono eraser. Now I have some Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and I use those landscape border dies to cut a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to use them all, but I hadn't decided at that point how many I needed, so I just cut a whole bunch of them. Now, the thing to keep in mind when you're placing these masks is the first hill here. You want that behind the pond. Now, you can cover up part of the fox, but you want to make sure that you're behind that pond, because this needs to be part of the front of the scene. Otherwise, it's going to look like that pond is going back behind this hill. So I have it at an angle, and because I have it at an angle, I'm going to have to make sure that my sides and my corners here are masked off so I don't get any ink on them when I start ink blending, which I'm actually going to do here in just a moment. I'm just making sure that I have that lined up, because you will see it if it doesn't follow the same curve when you start ink blending. And then I'm going to fold those over so everything is nice and secure. All right, so now I'm going to take a Lake House by W+9 and an ink dauber, and I'm just going to lightly blend over the edge of that mask. And when I say lightly, I mean lightly as in pressure, not necessarily lightly as in the depth of color. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing ink blending like this is you have no point of reference of how dark your ink is going to be. I strongly suggest as you go along that you lift a corner of that mask and you see, take a look at it and make sure that you have the color that you want. If you don't, keep going. If you pull that up and realize that, wow, that's really dark already, then stop there. Now, I do this enough. I kind of have an idea of how dark I want to go, so I don't do that, but that's a really good tip for you. Now I'm going to move on to the second hill. Now this one I also need to make sure that it's back behind that sled, because if you don't, it'll be just like that lake. It'll look like half the sled is on one side of the hill, half the sled is hanging out on the other side of the hill, and it just won't look right. So you can position that mask any way you want, just make sure that it is back behind that sled. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the masking. It's the same technique until I get as many hills as I want. And I think I did like 2 or 3 more, and then I'm going to call it good. And then I took those masks that I had already used and I cut them up so I can mask off everything that I've already done from the backside hill all the way down to the bottom one. Because I'm going to be doing some ink blending on that sky. I'm going to use my mini blending foams to do that because this is a bigger area. You could use ink daubers, however, you're going to be doing it for quite a while. All right, so now I'm back to the Lake House ink, and I chose this color because it's going to tie into the Lake House ink that I used on those hills. It's just going to make the card look a lot more cohesive. You could use different colors for your sky if you wanted. I just liked this idea. And also, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to get it done. So now I'm using Falling for Blue. This is a new blending foam for this ink, so you can see some of my foam marks, but that's fine. We're going to go over this again. You won't even notice it when it's done. Now I have cockle shell ink, and I'm trying to keep this color as close to the horizon line as I can, right up against that masking, because I don't want to make the sky look too dark. I'm trying to convey that this is a night scene or a darker scene, but I don't want it too dark up there because otherwise it's going to look like your card panel is split in two when it's done, and it won't look right. Now I'm going back in with the Falling for Blue, and I'm going right over the top of that cockle shell. It does tone it back quite a bit, but once it dries, it blends in really nice, and you do see that undertone of purple. Now I'm going to take the Lake House ink again, and I'm going to go over the top of everything. What this does is when it dries and everything absorbs into the fibers of the paper, it spreads out, and you can still see each color. You still get the idea of each color, but your blend is a little bit more seamless, and you don't see any more of those marks. So now that that's done, I'm pulling off the mask, and I'm going to be doing some really simple Copic coloring. I'm going to show you the bear. Both the fox and the bear are colored exactly the same with different colors, and I'll have those linked over on my blog. But I kept this really simple, primarily because it's such a simple scene. It doesn't need a whole lot, but also on my ring finger and my middle finger on my right hand, I broke those and tore the ligaments in those a couple years ago. And every once in a while, they swell up and they get really stiff and really sore, and it makes it hard for me to color. So I still want to color, so I just try to keep it as easy as possible, and it always works out well. It's just fine. Nobody's going to notice. Nobody's going to look at this card and go, wow, she really didn't put a whole lot of effort into it. So it's fine. What I'm doing right now is I'm starting with the E31 because I want this little guy to be brown, and I'm just mapping out where my shadows are going to go. And then I go in with the E37. This is my shadow color, and I go directly over the top of those lines I just did with the E31. Now, I am trying to keep in mind that this image is pretty small. He's pretty tiny. So I'm trying to be really conservative on my shadow colors. Now, at the end of the day, I do end up having to go back over this and kind of bring out my mids and my shadows a little bit more. However, it's okay because you can always go back in. It's so much easier to go back in with your colors than it is to take color away. So don't hesitate to err on the side of caution, which is what I'm doing. Now, also, I wanted to let you know while I'm finishing this guy up, this card actually, in the end, it was really easy to do. Normally when I make a card, I have a plan in my head. I can almost see it three-dimensionally. Like all of these images are floating around in my head and I see how they're going to work together and I can make a card. For this one, I really didn't have a clue. I just knew that I wanted to use this stamp set and I just kind of dove right in, and as I went is how it came out. I looked around my work area to see what I had laying out. Maybe I had stuff that I hadn't used yet, which I did, and I tried to decide how I could work this into this card, and that's what I did. Don't be afraid to just dive in, folks. You don't always need a plan. You don't always need to know what you're doing. Just get started. Throw something together. You never know what you're going to come up with. Now I'm just going to keep working at this guy until I get him how I want him. And the other thing to keep in mind when you're Copic coloring like this is you want to keep blending while the ink is still wet. However, you don't want to oversaturate. So a good tip is to just use flicking motions. It gets the color onto the paper, but you're not scrubbing, so it's not oversaturating. Occasionally, you can pause for a second or two to kind of let that alcohol evaporate so it doesn't spread out any further, but it's still kind of important that your ink is damp because that's how you get to the best blending. Now, I'm not going to show you how I color in the fox. I color him in the same way as I did the bear, just different colors, but I will show you those. I'll also have those linked over on my blog. I am going to show you how I color in the hat and the scarf, and I'm going to make these red. I liked the contrast between the red and those blues and purples, especially with that lake house, because it's a little bit more on the blue-green side. Red and blue-green is gorgeous. So I decided to go with red for these. You could make them any color you wanted. And these are small. They're just itty-bitty. So you're not going to see the majority of what I do because I'm holding my marker virtually straight up and down because I'm just using the tip and I'm being really careful how much I'm putting on of my darkest color, which is the R39, because I don't want these to go too dark either. Otherwise, you're not going to see the highlights and you won't see the movement when it's done. I am putting a little bit more effort into that scarf primarily because it sits so close to the front of the card. It is more noticeable. I do end up going back in later and adding some detail, but because I don't know what I'm doing as I'm going. I'm just doing it. I hadn't decided at this point that I would add that detail. So I'm coloring it in as if I'm just going to leave it plain. So I am paying closer attention to the shadows and the highlights on it. All right, now that is done, I'm going to color in the fox. I'm choosing the E19 color family because it does have some red undertones to it, and those look really nice with the reds that I chose for the hat and the scarf, but they also are perfect for a fox color. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to color in that fox's face, and I want his face to look white. However, some of it is going to be in shadow for one. And for number two, when you're coloring anything in white, all you're doing is coloring in the shadows. You still want to leave as much white space as possible. If you cover all that up, then you just have gray. So I'm sticking closest to like the bridge of his nose, around the bottom of his face, on that side of his body that is kind of tilted away from you. And I'm just adding my shadows there. I go from C00 in 1, C3, and I think I stopped there. I might have added in a little bit of C5. I would stop at C3. If you're nervous at all about coloring in white. All right, now I'm going to color in the sled, and I'm going a little bit darker than what I had colored the bear so you can tell them apart. Another thing is I go back in later and I outline all of these with an EK Success journaling pen, because I noticed that after I had everything colored in that my lines weren't as dark as I wanted them to be. And it worked out because then you could tell that there really was this sled underneath a bear because they're both brown. And I also make sure to concentrate my darkest shadow color under that little guy's bum. So it looks like he is sitting on top of it. And then also it kind of reinforces that they're two separate images. And I'm not doing anything fancy here. There's a lot of things that you can do when you color in wood, and I'm just not doing it. It's a small enough image, and because I go over it again later, it's not necessary to put in too much detail. All right, now I'm going to color in these trees. These are something else that I don't put a whole lot of effort into. I just want to make them look like they have varying shades in them. So the light hits them in different areas. But again, I'm not putting in a whole lot of detail. They're really thin, especially at the tips of those branches. So I'm making sure to only use the tip of my marker for one thing. And for another thing, if I put too much color on them, they're going to bleed outside of the lines. You could take your colorless blender and clean that up, but I really just didn't want to do that, especially because I have so much white and those snowy hills surrounding it. And then also something to keep in mind, when you go use a colorless blender over the top of any ink blending, it will move some of that ink and you'll see those lines. So I try to always keep that in mind. Now I'm just finishing these up. I'm blending them out. You could probably take a really fine tipped pen and you could go in and draw in some lines, maybe add some knots in the trees. That would look really cool. But in the end, this worked out just fine because I actually end up adding another detail to this later that you probably wouldn't even notice those lines and knots if you added them now. So I'm just about done with them. I'm making sure that I don't have anything bleeding outside of my lines there, but also I do want to reinforce a little bit where those branches kind of shoot out. And if you look real close, you can see that tree that's in the front there on the left, that should have actually been stamped first, not second, because those branches go back behind the tree that's behind it. That wouldn't be right, but it's fine. We're going to leave it. We're not even going to worry about it. So now I'm coloring in my little pond here, and this is really simple coloring. I'm just reinforcing those lines that are in the middle of the pond or closer to the center of the pond, and the shadows underneath my fox. And then where each of those curves are within the pond, I'm adding a little bit of shading there. I'm just using two colors on this because I don't want it too dark. I don't want it to compete with that fox because that, I don't know if you can tell in the video, but he's pretty dark. He stands out there, and I don't want those two competing with each other. I just want to give the idea that he is on some ice. And it would still cast a shadow, and I'm putting that shadow out there underneath his arm because that would also likely cast a shadow. And then I'm going to go over it one last time just lightly. I'm just kind of, it's a combination between a flicking motion and kind of skipping across the surface of my paper with my marker. And it helps blend out that darker color. I think that was B43, I think. I'll have that linked over on my blog. But it also kind of helps fill that in. I am leaving some white space in there, and I just go in with the tip of my darker color there and reinforce that, give it one last blend, and then we're going to move on to the finishing details. And I think this is really what helps tie everything in together. Now, it took me a day to finish this card. Even though it was really easy in the end, it took me a day because I pondered. I literally looked around my work area and decided how I was going to put this together. Now, due to recent projects that I have done, I had some of this already laying out, and I thought, why not do it again? That would help tie it in. It'll work perfectly. Plus, I got to use some brand new goodies that I hadn't used yet, so that was fun. So I'm going to take my quickie glue pen, and I'm going to just outline those those ripples in the pond with that. And then I'm going to take some Hero Arts sparkling clear embossing powder. I'm going to heat emboss those. And it gives it just a little bit of shimmer. I have not used this embossing powder before, and I dig it. It is gorgeous. So I'm going to also do that across the top of my little hills there. Now the quickie glue pen has a very fine tip, so you're just getting a fine line out of it. You could use a Versa marker. It has a little bit thicker tip. You can make those lines look a lot thicker, but that's not necessary. You're just kind of accentuating those hills. Now, one thing to note while I finish this part up is, and I didn't show you this, I did add some shadows to the base of those trees and underneath that sled. So those didn't look like they were just kind of hanging out there. So they looked like they were a part of the scene. I did those with those C markers that I did with for the white on the fox. And I'll have all of those listed over on my blog as well. And after I get the hills and that little pond done, I'm going to take my Spectrum Noir clear overlay pen and I'm going just up underneath that embossing. I have everything set and I'm just drawing a wide brush stroke with the full bristles of that pen. And as it's damp, because it stays damp just long enough that if you're fast enough, you can kind of pull that down with your finger so it blends out. And the more glitter that you have built up on your finger, the more of an effect you get, and it looks really cool, especially when it hits the light. Now I'm going to work on that little bear's hat. He has those 3 little puffs there. 2 of them hang down from the sides of his hat. And then he's got one there on the top. There's lots of different products you could use on this. I will have those listed over my blog as well in case you're interested. For this, I'm just taking my Versa marker pen and the Hero Arts satin pearl embossing powder. This is something else I haven't used before. And I'm going to heat emboss those. I do go over it twice because I want it to stand out quite a bit. By itself, the first layer of it is nice and soft and subtle, but I really wanted this to stand out. Now, I am taking a brush and just kind of brushing off the extra. I didn't do a very good job with my anti-static powder tool, and I don't want that to show up on that guy. So I'm just making sure I get those off there before I heat emboss it. And you can kind of see some of the shine now. Now I'm going to take a Uniball Signo white gel pen and I'm adding some dots to that to that scarf that I had talked about earlier. And another good thing would be a Sakura white glaze pen. That would be really cool. So I'm taking the Sakura clear glaze pen and I'm just going over the nose and the eyes. Now I did go over with a Copic multi-liner to reinforce those before I did that, so they look nice and black, and now they have a little bit of dimension. Now I'm taking a Uniball Signo silver gel pen and I'm going over the all of the metal on the sled, but I'm just only doing what would be closest to my light source. I do end up taking a black pen and cleaning up around those lines so they look cleaner and a little bit more straight, but I just love the shine that the silver pen gives on those. Plus I didn't have to worry about trying to Copic color it in. Now I'm going to add a sentiment to this. This is from the hand lettered Holiday by Wplus9. There's lots of different combinations you can use with the stamp set. I'm going to use Merry Christmas, and watch this, folks. I have this mounted onto my acrylic block here, and I kind of slapped it on there. I wasn't paying attention, and you're going to see what happens when you don't line up your stamps properly. I'm at the end of the day, I didn't worry about it, but you're going to see it. So I'm using the Wplus9 black ink because it is super crisp. I know that I'm going to get a nice crisp image the first time I stamped it, especially because I'm not using my Misty. It is a gorgeous black ink. I recommend anybody should have this in their stash. Now look at how that Christmas turns out. I am like, dope. I cannot believe I did that. But whatever. I have one last thing I'm going to do, and then you're probably not even going to notice that sentiment too much, so it's fine. This is the Wplus9 Biggest Fan stamp set, and I'm going to use those little tiny dots there. This was sitting out on my work surface. I have never used this before, and I was trying to think snow. Now, I do have snow stencils, but I decided, hey, let's give this a shot and see how it looks. I am going to use the Lawn Fawn Yeti white pigment ink. There's loads of white pigment inks out there that you can use. I like this one on top of ink blending because it always stands out the best, I think. And then as it dries back, it has like this amazing finish to it. So when you're looking at the card just right in the light, you can actually see all of it, even on top of all of that white. Now, I am going to do this entire panel. I'm even going to go over the top of my images. The only thing that I'm keeping in mind is that I don't want to do any of that stamping over anything important like their faces or anything like that, but I do stamp over the top of each of the images just enough that you get the idea that the whole entire scene has falling snow in it. And I might be kidding myself, but I don't seem to notice how bad I messed up that sentiment. Yeah, maybe not. All right, that's it. We are done. This card was so much fun. It was really nice to be able to just kind of wing everything. It's very rare that that happens for me. Normally, I have a crystal clear plan in my head, and that's what I do. So this was great. I really hope that I've inspired you all to kind of stretch your creative brain as well. And also, if you don't have the Winter Pal stamp set, this is totally worth having in your stash. It is a darling set. I'm so glad I got it out finally. Do be sure to head over to my blog for more details and links, as well as subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. Give me a thumbs up. I sure hope you enjoyed my card today. Thanks again so much for stopping by. Until next time.